The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello there, a very warm welcome back to Things Are About to Get Weird. And today I am one very excited podcast host. Not just because I'm back after my short break, but because in this episode we're combining two of my favourite things in the world: ghost stories and the Tudors. More specifically, one of the most fascinating and tragic figures associated with this period in history, the incomparable Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Before researching this episode, I had no idea just how many sightings of Anne's spirit have been reported through the years at multiple different prominent locations. So today, I'm asking a very specific question. Is the ghost of Anne Boleyn one of the most well-travelled in history? Or is her legend so powerful that it's inspired the creation of more than just a few myths about her afterlife? Let's find out. Now, a quick warning right at the start here. If you're familiar with the life and the death of Anne Boleyn, then you'll already anticipate that there will be a couple of gory details in this episode, particularly around the way that Anne's life was ended on the orders of her husband. So do take care before listening on today, as there will inevitably be some mentions of the way in which she left this earth. But if you're still with me, let's embark on a very quick whistle-stop tour of Anne's short life to get a little bit better acquainted with her. Now, very weirdly for a person of such note, it's actually not entirely clear when Anne was born. Whilst many experts believe that she was born in 1501, some academics are convinced that her year of birth was actually 1507. Different historical documents cite different dates, and I think it's one of those details that will continue to be debated for a very long time to come. What we do know is that her father was Sir Thomas Boleyn, who had previously worked with Henry VII before becoming very close with Henry VIII after he took the throne, and her mother was Elizabeth Howard, the aunt of Henry's eventual fifth wife, Catherine Howard, making Anne and Catherine cousins, although most historians don't believe that they would have ever actually met in person. Anne grew up in places including Kent and then in France, before returning to England in around 1522, and both herself and her sister Mary became ladies-in-waiting to Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. It's quite widely accepted that Mary had actually become one of Henry's extramarital partners, shall we say, and whilst the king had become infatuated with Anne too, it's thought that she refused to embark on an illicit relationship with him. Driven by the king's desire to have a son, which he didn't feel was possible with Catherine of Aragon, and his growing obsession with Anne, Henry set about trying to convince the Pope that he should be allowed to divorce his first wife in order to marry his new love. And as I'm sure you know, this didn't quite go to plan and ended up triggering a little something we know as the English Reformation. In a nutshell, because I'm sure you're keen for me to get to the paranormal part of this tale, the Pope denied Henry's request for divorce, and the king quickly and conveniently became very interested in the religious notion that God held the ultimate authority rather than the Pope anyway. So he defied Rome, dismissed Catherine, and married Anne in January of 1533, and only got around to annulling his first marriage in May of that year. But after Anne wasn't able to give Henry a male heir either, only managing to give birth to little Elizabeth, who we don't know much about after this point. Oh, sorry, I misspoke misspoke there. What I meant to say was that Anne gave birth to the future Queen Elizabeth I, who would grow up to be the longest reigning and arguably the most revered of all the Tudor monarchs. But of course, this wasn't good enough for the short-sighted Henry, and after falling out of favour with one of Henry's right-hand men, Thomas Cromwell, things rapidly went downhill for Anne. She was accused of all sorts, including adultery and potential treason, and she was famously executed by way of beheading at the Tower of London in 1536, just in time for Henry to marry the next woman he had become enthralled by, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. I swear to God, if Henry VIII has no haters, then I am no longer breathing. Anyway, what I wanted to illustrate with that very brief look at Anne Boleyn's life is that it was punctuated with scandal and frustration and ultimately tragedy and immense distress. So is it any wonder that many believe her spirit is still restlessly roaming some of the places that meant the most to her during her short years? And similarly, is it any surprise that one of the first locations mentioned when the topic of Anne's ghost comes up is, naturally, the Tower of London? Let's begin here, where her mortal life ended. One of the most notable spooky encounters at the Tower took place in the spot where Anne was buried after her execution, in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. And this encounter was actually recorded in a renowned Victorian paranormal publication, Ghostly Visitors, written by someone using the alias Spectre Stricken back in 1882. The account described the experience of a captain of the guard who, whilst he was alone one night near to the chapel, spotted a light burning from inside. The chapel was locked and no one should have been around, so he climbed a ladder and managed to peer inside to see what was taking place. This is what he saw. Quote, "Slowly down the aisle moved a stately procession of knights and ladies, attired in ancient costumes, and in front walked an elegant female whose face was averted from him, but whose figure greatly resembled the one he had seen in reputed portraits of Anne Boleyn. After having repeatedly paced the chapel, the entire procession, together with the light, disappeared." When I read this, the thing I kept picturing is that if the account is true, it would have all happened by candlelight, which is just extra eerie if you ask me. But this is far from the only famous sighting of a spirit believed to be that of Anne at the Tower. Another significant tale is even older than this one, having taken place in 1864, and this story centres around a spot close to where Anne was actually beheaded within the grounds of the Tower. At this time, a military man named Captain J.D. Dundas was stationed at the famous landmark when he noticed something strange. A yeoman warder watching over the tower was acting unusually, and after the captain took a closer look, he realized that the warder had drawn his bayonet and appeared to be defending himself from something. And as the captain then saw, that thing was the white figure of a lady, resembling Anne Boleyn, that seemed to be gliding along the ground directly towards the warder. The guard then lurched forward towards the figure, but his weapon went straight through the spirit, and in his utter shock, the warder actually fainted. It's said that the guard was soon discovered by another member of staff, and was actually reprimanded as it was assumed that he had been caught sleeping whilst on duty. But the captain soon came to his defence, corroborating the guard's terrifying explanation as to what had transpired. He confirmed that he had also seen this ghostly figure, and the warder was able to keep his job. But if the tales are to be believed, this guard actually got off lightly. There's yet a further story that's often been told about an incident that took place in 1817 when a sentry who was patrolling around the White Tower, one of the most iconic parts of the site, spied the ghoulish figure of the late Queen walking past him on a staircase. The experience was so terrifying to him that he reportedly suffered a fatal heart attack right there and then. As I'm sure you can imagine, there are countless other stories from the Tower of London regarding the apparent spirit of Anne Boleyn, and given that this was the place she died in an incredibly brutal manner, it's not entirely surprising to me. But I do want to move on to some of the other locations that Anne is said to still haunt, almost 500 years after she perished. Starting with a place I'm sure my fellow Tudor nerds may have expected me to mention, Hampton Court Palace. Now, I'm actually planning to do an entire episode about the spooky goings-on at Hampton Court, because there have been some exceptionally interesting paranormal events associated with this historical spot. But for today, I'll just be focusing on the stories concerning Anne. Well, Anne and perhaps a couple of other familiar names, because as legend has it, Hampton Court was not only one of the homes of Henry VIII and several of his wives in life, but it seems that some of them may have remained there in spirit after their deaths too. The ghosts of Anne Boleyn, as well as Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, who was also beheaded, and Jane Seymour, his third wife, who sadly passed away in 1537, are all said to roam the hallways and stairwells of the property, often in a state of distress or despair. Various accounts have noted that Anne's spirit has been sighted several times, either wearing a blue dress or a black ensemble, and some eyewitnesses have even reported that when her ghost showed itself, Anne was actually carrying her own head under her arm. Oof. Most describe her spirit as appearing sad and walking slowly, as opposed to Catherine Howard's, who often appears to be much more frenzied. But that's a different topic for another day. And don't worry, I definitely will be speaking about Hampton Court Palace further in a future episode of the podcast. But whilst we're on the topic of Anne's various residences, we also have to talk about Windsor Castle. And there's a particularly tragic yet oddly sweet angle to one of the key haunting tales linked to her at this particular royal household. The Dean's Cloister at the castle is a corridor hundreds and hundreds of years old, which links the royal apartments of the castle to St. George's Chapel. It's very Hogwarts-esque, really beautiful, and allegedly also very haunted. This is the spot where numerous people claim to have seen Anne's spirit, often standing by one of the windows. But if we're to believe some of the other tales from this incredibly historic residence, there's a chance she's not alone, because one of the other spirits that's said to still linger in the corridors of Windsor Castle is none other than that of Anne Boleyn's daughter, the late Queen Elizabeth I. In fact, it's even thought that her ghost has been sighted by members of the royal family themselves. According to an article in The Times, our reigning monarch, King Charles III, is one of those who has allegedly had an encounter with Elizabeth's spirit at the castle. And a Marie Claire piece I found features a quote from paranormal historian Richard Felix, made in the documentary The King of UFOs, in which he claims, quote, "The late Queen saw her namesake, Queen Elizabeth I, in the library at Windsor Castle. The King has seen the same ghost, and his grandfather, George VI, saw Queen Elizabeth 8 times in the library before the start of the Second World War. Additionally, all the way back in 1897, a member of the Grenadier Guards, Lieutenant Carr Glynn, was the witness in another apparent sighting of Elizabeth. He was sitting in the castle's library when a figure dressed all in black drifted past him, before turning around a corner and swiftly vanishing, despite the fact that there was no doorway she could have exited the library from in that direction, and that there were no other visitors in the space that day as a matter of record. If these anecdotes are accurate, I think this is astonishing, and even more fascinating when you do add in the additional details about the sightings of Anne Boleyn too, when you consider that Elizabeth wasn't even 3 years old when her mother was executed. The idea of their spirits existing together in the same meaningful location is as beautiful as it is harrowing, in my opinion. I tried to find some specific stories where one person had seen both of their spectres, but I didn't have any luck. However, as a believer myself, I do find the idea of their energies finding one another from beyond the grave really touching, especially because they were robbed of so much time together in life. But what if we were to go back even further into Anne's past, prior to the time she made her ill-fated connection with the man who would become both her husband and the reason for her death? Because there are 2 more notable properties with which Anne had major ties that are strongly believed to be haunted by her presence. And whilst they're not as famous as the Tower of London or Windsor Castle, you could argue that the stories bound to these locations are some of the most intriguing of all. The first of these is the stunning Blickling Hall in Norfolk, which is today looked after by the National Trust and is open for visitors, and has officially just made it onto my list of places to visit. The original property which stood on the estate was at one point during the very early 16th century owned by the Boleyn family, and many historians agree that it's likely that not only Anne but her siblings were all born there. The grand house you see today was largely built and continually added to and adjusted in the centuries after Anne's residence at Blickling. But nonetheless, the site was almost certainly somewhere that meant a lot to the Boleyns. So, could this be why, on the 19th of May, the anniversary of her death, Anne's ghost is said to occasionally return to the place of her birth? Over the centuries, it's reported that numerous people have experienced the same eerie display on this fateful date. The vision of a carriage driven by a headless coachman and pulled along by 6 headless horses, which moves up the driveway towards the hall. The passenger inside is said to be Anne Boleyn, cradling her own head in her lap, dressed all in white. As the tale goes, once the coach reaches the front door, it vanishes into thin air, but not before Anne steps out and moves inside to walk the hallways until dawn the following day. And just like with our previous tale about Windsor Castle, many believe Anne is not alone when she re-emerges at her birthplace for her Maytime visit. Some are adamant that the man driving the carriage is actually her father, Thomas Boleyn, and here's where things take an even darker turn. The full history behind this is much more complex than I'm about to explain, but essentially, Thomas Boleyn is remembered by many historians as a man who did very little to help his children, namely Anne and his son George, when they ended up in incredibly dangerous and ultimately deadly situations. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, Thomas was a close comrade of Henry VIII's, and when the king decided that he wanted Anne out of the way so that he could marry Jane Seymour, he and Cromwell began to accuse her of some major offences, but perhaps none so scandalous as an affair with her own brother, George. And whilst it's widely accepted that this was nonsense, the truth ultimately did nothing to save Anne or George. Their father also did nothing to try and save them, and although it's long been argued that any attempts would have been futile anyway, and would likely only have resulted in Thomas's own downfall, I'm sure that this was little comfort to the two Boleyn children as they sat there facing execution. But what does this have to do with the hauntings, I hear you ask? Well, my theory is that if Thomas Boleyn's spirit has really been sighted driving his headless daughter around by carriage, perhaps this could be a metaphor for the fact that he essentially helped pull her towards a life that would result in a terrible fate as a way to further his own political position. Even if the tales are somewhat exaggerated or fabricated, I think the metaphor still stands, and it doesn't surprise me that this legend lives on within the walls, or rather the grounds, of Blickling. Some accounts even suggest that after Thomas drops Anne off in the carriage at the front entrance, he is then chased away from the property by demons and forced to continue on with his terrifying otherworldly travels indefinitely as a form of punishment for his actions or lack of action after his children were condemned. There's actually even more to this spine-chilling date in the calendar though, because on the 19th of May, it's also said that George's spirit sometimes returns to their alleged birthplace, but instead of riding in the carriage with his sister, his ghost has apparently been seen being dragged through the grounds by 4 headless horses. Again, this position of helplessness, even in death, is quite reminiscent of how he was treated towards the end of his life. Once he had been accused of certain crimes by the king and his close associates, it was as good as his death warrant being signed. There was almost no need for a trial. Genuinely awful stuff all round as far as I'm concerned. But, as strange as it sounds, given the appalling way her life ended, not all of the stories about Anne Boleyn's ghost are full of terror and woe. In fact, in the next location I wanted to tell you about, most of the tales about her presence making itself known are actually quite wholesome. So join me as we head on over to Hever Castle in Kent, another property which was owned by the Boleyn family during Anne's early years, and somewhere many believe she spent a lot of time growing up. Anne's ghost is said to appear at Hever mostly around Christmas time, specifically on Christmas Eve, where a spirit resembling the late Queen has been sighted crossing over a bridge in the grounds, under which runs the picturesque River Eden. This image is, of course, much more tranquil and peaceful than the encounters people have described at Blickling. According to the Times, both visitors to the castle and the staff that work there have seen this vision of Anne dressed in white gliding around the grounds in a manner that suggests her soul is more restful at Hever than anywhere else. In a weird twist though, Hever Castle is also the place that it's believed Henry VIII started courting Anne and persuading her to look at him through a romantic lens rather than just seeing him as her king. There's a huge oak tree that still stands in the castle's grounds to this day, and her ghost has occasionally been observed resting under the tree, a reflection of a pastime it's highly likely she enjoyed during her time on Earth. Kate McCaffrey, a historian who works as an assistant curator at Hever Castle, spoke to Artnet about the purported sightings of Anne's spirit at the landmark and explained that, quote, Anne used Hever as an escape away from the prying eyes of court during those scandalous years, which again definitely matches up with these more harmonious sightings. But sadly, not every encounter with Anne's apparition here have been as calm. In 1967, a man named C.W. Bamford wrote to the man who, at that time, owned the castle, Lord Astor, and claimed that he was actually a descendant of the Boleyns and wished to visit the property. This must have been agreed because he found himself on a visit to the space it's thought was Anne's bedroom, and he was given quite the welcome. After entering the room, he saw what he described as, quote, a young woman, some 25 or 26 years of age, in some distress, fists beating on the windowsill, scrabbling of fingernails on the surrounding walls. I can definitely draw Anne's spirit within reach. I'd argue that if this story is genuine, that perhaps she wasn't the biggest fan of people actively trying to seek her out, and that this display could have been her way of saying that she preferred her spirit to be kept out of the reach of a stranger, supposed descendant or not. Now, I wouldn't blame you at all if you're thinking, crikey, how many more places can one person's ghost reportedly reside? And honestly, I hear you, but with Anne's life and death being so sensational, for lack of a better term, it probably won't surprise you to learn that there are yet further spots where incidents involving her spirit have been recorded. Take Marwell Hall, for instance. Today, this historic Hampshire building sits within the grounds of Marwell Zoo, but it was actually once owned by the Seymour family and is the location at the centre of one of the most enduring Tudor rumours relating to the marriage between Jane Seymour and Henry VIII. Legend has it that Henry would visit Marwell Hall to meet with Jane whilst he was very much still married to Anne Boleyn, and the two would stroll along the property's yew tree walk while speaking of plans for their future wedding, which would happen once Anne's execution had taken place, of course. How romantic. But the stories go a step further, implying that Henry and Jane could have married in secret on the 19th of May 1536, the very date of Anne's beheading, before their official public wedding, which the history books have recorded as having taken place on the 30th of May. Some sources even go as far as to state that Henry was waiting for signals from a series of beacons to let him know that Anne's execution had been carried out, so that he was free to marry Jane the very moment his second wife had been killed on his orders. So once again, if you're a believer in the paranormal, you may not be entirely shocked to learn that Anne's frustrated spirit has occasionally been detected wandering along this same yew tree walk, taken by her husband and the successor to not only her position as his wife, but as the Queen of England too, all while she was sat in the Tower of London awaiting her terrible fate. In addition, Jane herself is also thought to remain at Marwell Hall in spirit form, and considering that she died just a year after her marriage to Henry, perhaps it makes sense that her ghost attached itself to a place she had so recently been happy prior to her untimely passing. The final spot I had to mention is the Saul Church in Norfolk. Now, there's not a huge amount of information available about this supposedly haunted place, but the stories are linked with another fascinating Tudor rumour that I had to tell you about. Some have long believed that at some point Anne's remains were actually removed from the chapel at the Tower of London, or were never buried there at all, and were moved to the Saul Church to ensure that she was ultimately laid to rest in the same place as some of her ancestors. And this rumour appears to have sparked some tales of her ghost manifesting at the church, possibly as a way to confirm her presence at this more homely sanctuary, rather than at the place of her execution. However, like with many of the tales I've shared today, and as I've alluded to throughout, this account is very tricky to verify, impossible even. As a believer, do I think it's possible that Anne Boleyn's spirit could very well be restlessly wandering somewhere, particularly somewhere that represented a key event in her life? Yes, it's possible. But do I also think that a number of the stories that have emerged from some of the locations I've noted today are perhaps on the fanciful side? Again, it's very possible. When it comes to the ghosts of very famous historical figures, it makes sense that if they were associated with a landmark or a building in life, then it's something that people may automatically link them with in death too. If someone were to see a white lady ghost at the Tower of London, for example, who is one of the first women you would think of? I'd bet that Anne Boleyn would be right up there. Ultimately, whether you believe that Anne's spirit really has been seen in some, all, or none of these places will be totally personal to you. But whether you're a paranormal devotee or decidedly more skeptical, if you were to visit any of the places I've explored in today's episode, could you see yourself keeping one eye out, maybe looking over your shoulder a little, just in case the tragic Queen did make one of her legendary appearances? Oh, I am making a prediction right now that this episode is going to split opinion. I always find that the more famous or infamous the ghost, the more strongly people tend to feel on both sides of the believer scale. So, on that note, what do you make of the tales of Anne Boleyn's spirit? Do you think she really does continue to travel around from beyond the grave, never allowing people to forget the injustices that were done to her? Or do you think that the stories stem from the fact that people are just eternally enthralled by anything related to the Tudors? I am already excited to read your comments, so please do leave me all of your thoughts either here on the episode page or over on our social media pages. But for now, it's that time once again, so come with me as we head on over to our regular outro feature, Weird Media. Today's recommendation is one for my fellow horror film fans, and I feel like this might also divide opinion a little bit, but I'm standing firm in my absolute love for this movie. Like many of you, I'm sure, I grew up being a fan of the 28 Days Later and then 28 Weeks Later films. They were absolute staples of the 2000s horror flick scene, and when 28 Years Later was announced, I was so excited. So I watched the first installment in what I believe is going to be the 28 Years Later trilogy, which came out in 2025, and I thought it was great. And I was immediately excited for the second part to come out this year in 2026. Now, for some reason, time slipped away from me, and I only got around to watching part 2, which has the subtitle of The Bone Temple, a couple of weeks ago, and oh my god, I loved it. I have to admit that I found myself feeling a bit meh about a lot of recent film releases in general, but after I finished watching The Bone Temple, including the epilogue bit right at the end, no spoilers, I was like, this is perfect. Now, of course, the idea of perfection when it comes to films is entirely subjective, but it's safe to say that I really enjoyed it. Like many people, I'm a big fan of Ralph Fiennes, but there's something about his performance in The Bone Temple that was just extra captivating. And that's saying something for an actor of his caliber. The entire film was packed full of great performances, especially from the younger cast members too. And whilst of course there was plenty of gore and some jumpy moments, there were also a couple of really emotional points too, and some major twists and turns along the way. I cannot wait for the third film of the series. I'm genuinely already excited for it. So if you were a fan of 28 Days and Weeks Later but haven't checked out the more recent offerings, this is your sign to give them a whirl. A big thank you once again for tuning in for this week's episode of the podcast. I really appreciate your patience during my little holiday break too. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including links and shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research. And I'll also be listing our social media pages along with our email address. If you're tuning in on Spotify, please feel free to leave us a comment to share your views on today's topic. And you can also get in touch on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or Threads too. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would hugely appreciate a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's an amazing free way to support the show. Finally, if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks so much again for being here today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.